Here in Istanbul, journalists, academics, and writers from across the world are attending a two-day conference to discuss the coverage of Palestine. Slain Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi was scheduled to be there as a guest speaker. For more on this, let's cross over to our TRT World's Ahmet Alioglu, who is at the conference now. Ahmet.
Kilmany, this is the second day of the conference about the international coverage and how the discourse of the media should be developed on Palestine. It's organized by Tawasul. This is the third conference that they organize. According to these organizers, they're telling us that more than 90 countries participated in this conference. We are joined here by Ben White, who's a famous author and journalist, writes regularly about the Palestinian cause. Ben, in your recent book about the Palestinian cause, Cracks in the Wall, Beyond Apartheid in Israel, do you, in your conclusions, do you come out to the conclusion that Israel practices amount to real apartheid state?
Actually, that's what I set up in the beginning part of the book. I think that it's a pretty straightforward case to make. The Israeli authorities practice institutionalized discrimination against Palestinians, whether they have citizenship inside the 67 lines. There is an even more explicit regime of segregation and discrimination for Palestinians in the West Bank. And of course, in the Gaza Strip, Palestinians are also experiencing the sort of most brutal form of Israeli apartheid, fenced off, blockaded, attacked many times. But the key thing to think about is that this is a whole regime, a single regime. The Israeli authorities control the lives of all the people living between the river and the sea in all of historic Palestine, and Palestinians face varying degrees of systematic, institutionalized discrimination.
But do you think that the international media, this discourse is well promoted? Because still, if you look at The Guardian and the recent developments, they tweeted that one Israeli officer has been killed and 7 Palestinians died. So still this kind of discourse, I'm not saying that it's pro-Israel, but the narrative of the Palestinian side is not so prevalent in the international media. Don't you think so?
Yeah, there's been improvements, but there are still a lot of problems in how the issue of Palestine is reported on. Too often, Israeli violence, the routine, actual daily violence of occupation, is absent or is whitewashed, and Palestinian violence is often presented decontextualized. The framework is often that Palestinians, quote-unquote, attack and Israel responds. And in fact, the kind of systematic discrimination I was mentioning earlier, again, is often absent from coverage of the region. And without that context, it's very easy to produce distorted coverage.
Do you think these kind of conferences will create a challenge to these paradigms, stereotypes in the international community? Is it the Palestinians who should take the lead and, intervene or kind of, go to this side and practice more activities, or the international community, the international media should be the one who highlight more on this?
From what I can see in this conference, and this is a microcosm, there is a lot of amazing Palestinian talent out there, a lot of activists and media workers. And I think for those of us who are working in the media in different capacities, I think our role and responsibility is to provide platforms and boost those Palestinian voices who are working on fresh and creative expressions of describing their situation and lived reality.
Okay, now the recent developments in Gaza, what's happening and the repercussions on the Israeli side, they're speaking about an early election because of what happened, the resignation of Lieberman as a defense minister. Do you think that Israel is coming to a political turmoil?
So there would have to be elections at the latest by November next year, by law, but it might well be the case that the elections happen earlier. Lieberman's resignation was directly connected to what happened in Gaza, but it was also a reflection of some other issues. I think on Gaza specifically, there is a kind of paralysis or dead end with respect to Israeli politics, because there are those who are calling for stronger Israeli violence and attacks on Gaza, but there's also a recognition from many in the army, for example, that they don't wish to directly occupy the Gaza Strip, basically because of a deterrence factor created by Palestinian factions in the Gaza Strip. The bigger picture, Netanyahu is obviously keen to be re-elected himself, and the other political parties that are part of the Israeli coalition are also considering their options. Often they're competing over a similar voter base, particularly on the Israeli right. And so the Jewish Home Party, Likud, for example, are competing over who can appear most right-wing. And Lieberman's party, too, had not been doing well in the polls up to this point. So there's a lot of specific interests, and the Gaza situation of the last week was a kind of tipping point.
We were on the brink of an all-out war, and things were developing so fast. But things calmed down after the recent ceasefire. Do you think a possible all-out war is imminent between the two sides, or a ceasefire will be sustained?
I'd say it seems unlikely that it's imminent. I say unlikely because actually you never know when there can be a trigger. I mean, as we saw most recently, it was a week ago that there was an Israeli undercover raid in Gaza that led to this latest escalation. The main problem is that the underlying factors, blockade, occupation, are not being addressed. There are economic sticking plasters that are proposed and applied, but until those root causes are addressed, there's always a chance for escalation.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you so much. So lots of things are happening here in Palestine. Lots of developments are happening. That was Ben White to speak about these developments. Back to you, Kilmane, in the studio.
All right, Ahmet Alioglu there for us in Istanbul covering that conference. Thanks for that.